Next, we're going to talk about archival research. This does differ from content analysis, though it is very similar. Really, the only thing that makes archival research different than content analysis is archival research is generally drawn from more reliable sources, historical records, existing data sources, empirically reviewed papers. So these can include newspapers, vital records, medical histories, voter registration and poll results, academic records. So one of the ways to potentially kind of conceptualize whether you're doing archival research or content analysis, content is we're analyzing the entertainment or the content that's created by a culture to infer what's occurring. Archival research generally is using what we would consider to be more objective records from the historical record. So one of the ways to maybe also conceptualize this is that with content analysis, three people could watch the same content, let's say a 20-minute episode, and come up with slightly different results. In other words, they could basically, this is how I perceived inter-family relations were portrayed in this particular sitcom. While someone else might go, actually, I think you're a little bit wrong. In other words, there is some subjectiveness to the analysis of the content. If you showed three people the same newspaper article, which reports that in a particular date, a particular event happened and a particular number of people died, there would probably be no disagreement on what those actual numbers are. Now, there could be possibly disagreement with what the actual bias of the person making the report is. But generally speaking, when we're looking at archival research, we're looking at data or information that there is little debate on what it's actually telling us. It's a little bit more numerical, honestly. So this can include statistical records, so basically looking for trends across the United States. If you've ever seen a map of the US that's showing anything represented visually, for example, voting records or wildfires or crime statistics, those are examples of archival research using statistical records. We could also be looking at pre-existing surveys that we're not actually creating the survey and we're not administering the survey, but they're widely available. I use this a lot in my own research where I'm actually asking questions about crime rates throughout the United States at various periods of time. And a lot of times I'm using FBI surveys and data based on crime rates and crime statistics that they've gathered. This could also include written words and records or documents. For example, if you're interested in what the actual process of the formation of our Constitution was back in the 1700s, you could be looking at the Federalist Papers, for instance, which basically strongly argued for our current Constitution. There's also quite a few documents and written records from the Anti-Federalists, so basically the people that were still supportive of the idea of a democratic republic, but were not supportive of the idea of a stronger federal or unified government that the Constitution somewhat supported. So state rights and, of course, federal rights have always been a contention within this country, but it was extremely contentious as the Constitution itself was formed of how strong would our federal government be compared to our individual states. Some important archival discoveries that have been done due to archival research. So the increased risk of cancer if exposed to radiation, asbestos, vinyl chloride, etc. Almost all of these were actually not done through experimental studies or even necessarily initially quasi-experimental studies. They were done through archival research where it basically was looking for where is cancer most likely to occur and starting to realize that there was additional variables that predict it. Now, again, this is not necessarily purely archival because at some point that archival research started to look for patterns and became quasi-experimental. In other words, what happens when we compare people that have been exposed to radiation to those that haven't? Do their cancer rates change? And the answer, of course, is that they do. That would be a quasi-experimental study. But the fact that we even knew to look was based on archival research, where we started to see patterns in the actual rich data of the archives that basically people that were researching, for example, radiation, or people that worked with asbestos seemed to be having much higher rates of cancer. Congenital malformation of infants and mothers if they had German measles during pregnancy. Again, now, once we actually started to see this trend, there were additional studies that were used. And again, I really want to focus that science is building a house of bricks. And each brick adds to our knowledge. we're focused right now on that foundation, the kind of qualitative archival research, which often leads to further quasi-experimental studies that are looking for these patterns to find out, is it statistically relevant? Increased risk of vaginal cancer in daughters and women. We have given hormone therapy during pregnancy. Swartz and Bansky in 1977, the extent of a home team advantage in sports, by the way, it's 54%. So regardless of skill, playing on your home field does give you an advantage because it's also where you practice. And we can kind of get to that with various theories, including the idea that where you study is actually where you perform better. And Carl Smith and Anderson in 1979 correlated the occurrence of urban riots to daily temperature records and noticed that there was a direct relationship between the hotter it was, the more likely you are to get riots. Now, again, there may be additional factors involved here, but it did also start to indicate that basically it created a theory that was then later put to the test that as you make an environment less enjoyable, you tend to also see increases in regression or aggression. Archival research also found a strong correlation between suicide and country music in Sack and Gunglatch in 1992. They looked at 49 metropolitan areas. They looked at radio and recording ratings, reports, and directories. In other words, they determined what areas were listening on the radio to country music versus popular music versus heavy metal music versus classic rock. And then using an inter-university consortium of political and social results actually looked at suicide. The results, they actually found a strong relationship between areas that listened to country music and areas that had a high suicide rate. Now notice that archival research does have a major limitation. It's not looking at cause. So a lot of people hearing this might think that like Gothic music or alternative music or heavy metal might have a stronger relationship. This study actually did not find that. It found that mainly the only one that actually had a strong predictor was country music. Now, there have been additional studies that have looked at specific types of music. I think the number one predictor based on individual taste is actually Bob Dylan, of all people. But again, there's additional confounds. And the confounds could include, generally speaking, one of the things that didn't look in this study is the areas that enjoyed country music more, where suicide rates were higher, were also economically disadvantaged areas where people were not making as much money, where there were less jobs, which might also result in, so again, if we think about causation, it may be that being in a low-paying blue-collar job results in you liking country music more, which also results in you being in a more desperate situation that results in a greater increase in suicide. This is not necessarily what I'm not saying this is what's happening, but that's what the problem with almost all qualitative research, including archival research, is we always have to ask, what are the possible other explanations? Going back to those previous slides, when we were talking about, for example, the heightened temperature and increase in riots, it definitely started to create theories that we could then bring into quasi-experimental and experimental tests to look at aggression. But at the same time, it could have very much been that there was something else going on. In fact, the initial archival research that looked at this actually found a strong relationship between ice cream sales and violence. That didn't mean that buying more ice cream made people more violent. It represented, again, the hidden variable of temperature. But that temperature might also be hiding something else, which could include the news cycle, could include basically people being out more. So basically just human contact. You're much more likely to stay inside when it's cold. You're much more likely to go out and do things when it's warm. So that might also be that it has nothing to do with temperature. It simply has to do with human contact. So again, those confounds are something we want to consider. So the advantages of archival research, it's open, often very easy to obtain. You can create very large sample sizes. However, you don't know if a phenomenon, actually, and again, an advantage is sometimes you don't know a phenomenon exists until evidence accumulates. Natural disasters, school violence, for instance. These are things that may not be detectable in an individual study in a couple of months, but may start to show up as you get years and years of data. Some of the disadvantages, types of information is limited. You have to make do with what's available. Information may be incomplete or missing. Records may be missing and there might be errors. And you don't always know the method of data collection. There could have been carryover effects of the same people being studied over and over again. Is there a systematic rotation of who's being involved? Are there other confounds that aren't being accounted for in the data you're looking at? So the next group of studies we're going to look at as far as non-experimental qualitative data is natural experiments. Natural experiments investigate the effects of a natural occurring event that cannot be manipulated by the experimenter. A natural experiment is naturally occurring instance which duplicates a scientific experiment. The cause is not directly manipulated, however, and the effect is not necessarily measured unobtrusively. So we're going to give some examples of this where, again, this is starting to blur the lines, where we're starting to look at the possibility, and much like archival research, where we may be looking at multiple variables for a pattern, but if we find that pattern, we're going to move forward to additional experimentation to look into it. So some examples is Asian tsunamis, hurricanes, the Florida presidential election in 2000 and 2004, Down syndrome. All of these are things that we are definitely probably interested in researching. What are the effects of a hurricane? How often are hurricanes happening? What are the effects of a tsunami? What were the sociological effects of a Florida recount in a presidential election? Are there systematic causes or potential predictors of Down syndrome? All of these would be examples of natural experiments, looking to see how people behave in these situations without actually directly manipulating them. Another example was Sargent, Shepard, and Gantz in 2004, where they looked at the actual eruption in Helena, Montana. So, and actually, I'm sorry, not the volcano, that's another study. This one was actually looking at the smoking ban. So from June 2002 to December 2002, there was a smoking ban. This was a geographically isolated area. There was one hospital, and they looked at, did this actually have an effect? And they actually found the rate of heart attacks dropped by 60%. Now, it should be noted that this was a small area with a small population over a small period of time. This could have also been just a effect of chance being lumpy. And the idea behind chance being lumpy is a lot of times you may have heard the concept that lightning only strikes once in one location. Actually, lightning is well known to strike in multiple locations. And if we look at lightning strikes across the United States, it's not as randomly distributed as we think it would be. There's actually some areas that are struck a lot by lightning in a couple of years. But if we looked across decades, we would find that those areas may not be being hit by lightning at all in other periods of time. So that might also be a confound that we're catching with this natural experimentation technique. So an ethnography is a method in which researchers observe behavior through firsthand experiences by immersing themselves in the population they're studying. It's common in cultural studies, recording behavior and conversations through audio, visual, or extensive memoing or notes. So a lot of times this is how we start to get information about phenomenon that are a little bit less common and are usually very much in an in-group situation where we need to join that group. So generally speaking, there are complete participation, very natural, non-intrusive. There's also, we have to think about potentially non-complete participation. So again, this is an entire area of study with an enormous amount of research available and how you do ethnographies. But I think the very first thing you need to realize is that there's basically a couple of quick breakdowns. One of them is, do the people know they're being observed? Now, this may feel like you wouldn't get the right measurement, but there's been a fair amount of examples of ethnographies where someone has told them, I am a researcher, I am here to learn about your group, and I want to do and participate as much as possible that is legal so that I can learn about your group. What we find is generally people kind of forget the researcher is there. So the behavior is unnatural to begin with, but it becomes very natural. There's also been some examples of ethnographies which were completely participative without them knowing. For example, a researcher once joined the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club as a Hells Angel with them having no knowledge that that person was actually a researcher that was actually researching them. There was also a case where a famous psychologist, Fessinger, actually joined a doomsday cult, a UFO cult, and participated and pretended that they were a member of that cult together, basically an ethnography of the behavior. And by the way, this theory, this observation is what eventually led to the theory of cognitive dissonance. Because what he found was that most of the participants actually doubled down when they were confirmed that what was expected didn't happen. It was a doomsday cult. They were expecting the world to end, and it didn't. And you'd think that logically people would just immediately disband afterwards. But what they actually did is most of them actually became more dedicated to the cult. And this observation is what got Fessinger starting to think about a theory of cognitive dissonance, that when our behaviors don't match our thoughts, it's easier to change our thoughts than our behaviors. So that all came from initially a non-experimental study. So a couple of the things we want to think about is that we do want to make sure it's non-intrusive. There is the Heisenberg principle that measurement change what is being measured. There's also the Hawthorne effect that just watching motivates those that are watching to change their behavior, and we have to be careful of those. So some of the disadvantages, subjects may feel betrayed. So for example, with the Hell's Angel example I just gave, they ended up finding the person and beating them within an inch of their lives for having done what they did. Observers must carry out participation in full and observe at the same time. This may include behaviors that are not necessarily legal, and someone has to think, what are we going to do if that situation occurs? And you may see something you don't want to see or do something you don't want to do. And again, you have to think about these two going into this kind of a methodology. So as I mentioned, ethnography, participant is observer. Observer's purpose is not concealed, but observations is made subservient to the participation. You're part of the group before you're a researcher. People do tend to forget that you're observing and that you've lied to them. It reduces ethical problems. However, there is some intrusiveness, but observer is usually accepted after a while. And again, Hunter S. Thompson, who's wasn't an actual researcher, he was a journalist who joined the Hells Angels. They actually knew to some degree that he was planning to write a book about them, but they actually thought he was going to write a positive portrayal. His book actually was not. Hells Angels, The Strange and Terrible Saga of the Outlaw Motorcycle Gang. And there is some ethical questions. If you read that book, he did witness some very heinous crimes as a part of his observation. So again, we have observer as participant, observes first, participates second. Observer is clearly an outsider, or observer. Observer has no participant role. In-depth interaction is still possible. We also have you're a participant. People don't know that you're observing. Those are all possibilities when we look at the ethnography. Another way we can gather information is focus groups. Focus groups are groups of participants arranged by the researcher who acts as a mediator or facilitator of discussion based on a loosely structured set of questions. Groups can vary in size, 6 to 10 roles, and the goal of the researcher is to learn more information. We see focus groups used by a lot of organizations to kind of learn more about their participants, learn more about their employees. We also see it in a lot of marketing. So there's a lot of focus groups where, what do you think of this product? What do you think of this advertising campaign? But we also find focus groups looking at psychological constructs and trying to determine how people are responding to various interventions. A couple of things to just kind of note, and again, when we talk about focus groups, there's an entire area of study on how to do these correctly. But I want to just briefly talk about first the role of the facilitator. The facilitator is the one that's actually creating the question and is going to guide the conversation. But a good facilitator is not going to let their own presumptions kind of sour, if you will, the conversation. And their role is more of mediating to make sure that everyone's viewpoints are heard. When you create a focus group, generally you're going to have 6 to 10 people involved, but you also want to think about how are you going to actually get people that are not necessarily beholden to each other. So for example, a poor focus group might be a work team that includes their boss and their boss's boss. There's a very good chance they're not going to talk honestly in that situation. A better focus group would be all of the employees without the bosses present. Again, there's questions of anonymity and confidentiality when we're doing focus groups, because though we as a researcher can guarantee that no one will be identified, someone that speaks up in front of other coworkers, everyone's going to know who said what they said. So it tends to be more conversational. The social interaction generates discussions, which might also help people come out and talk about things they normally wouldn't. Not all participants will get equal time, but it is the role of the researcher to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. It can also be used to communicate, promote awareness of a topic, great learning experience for all, and provides potential future contact. So there's also advantages beyond just the research with using focus groups. Another technique is interviews. In interview, researchers ask loosely structured questions or structured questions to individual participants to learn about their personal experiences of a topic. Sample sizes are typically small when time and resources are limited, requires about 1 to 2 hours per interview, and eliminates the problem in competing in conversations we see in focus groups. Discussion is facilitated only by the researcher, and it increases confidentiality as no one else other than the researcher is hearing what the person's opinions are. Whether you use an interview or focus group tends to be more of what kind of resources you have and how sensitive the topic is. The less sensitive and the less resources, the more likely you might use focus groups. The more sensitive or the more time and resources you have, the more likely potentially interviews will occur. A good question is, how many focus groups do I run? How many interviews do I run? The rule of thumb with focus groups is 3 to 5. With interviews, it's usually 8 to 11. But the real reality is that you typically want to run them until you aren't hearing new ideas. In other words, when everything is just basically recycling, the same concepts are just being brought up again and again, that's usually when you can stop doing either of these techniques. Because again, we're gathering information. When we're doing interviews, again, we have two broad types, intrusive versus unintrusive. Intrusive, reactive influence is what is being measured. People tell you what they think you want to hear, or they tell you the opposite. So again, when we have an intrusive or reactive influences, that's what we're looking at. If it's unintrusive, non-reactive, we do not influence. Makes any response seem okay, doesn't hint at what you're looking at. So we want to avoid intrusive, reactive influences in what we're measured. An example of this can be the questions that we ask. For example, if we ask a question, like most people, do you disagree that no matter what follows, you've just told them how to expect to respond to that response. You've told them most people disagree. A better question would simply be to ask them, what are your thoughts about? And not put those requirements in. So this is wrapping up our brief touching on non-experimental qualitative designs, just to give us some feedback and some concepts of what's occurring often before we move forward to the idea of theory, testing that theory with empiricism and observation and determinism in a falsifiable way that is repeatable.